Okay, boys and girls, today we're going to talk about the reproductive system, and this is the really easiest one to teach of all because most of you have a lot of knowledge about the reproductive system compared to, say, the digestive system or the respiratory system. Men, especially, appear to do a lot of research on both the anatomy and physiology related to the reproductive system. But today and in the next few lectures, we're going to answer other types of questions which you may not be so familiar with. And you'll be able to understand anatomical oddities such as why the gonadal arteries start way up in the kidneys and what this cartoon penguin is supposed to represent. So long ago, we looked at some of the differences in the male and female skeleton, such as the shapes of the skull and the pelvis. And there's also that overall difference in skeletal muscle mass between men and women. And so in a more complex way and not really understood, there are also differences in the brain as well. And these are all secondary sex characteristics and are going to be driven by testosterone and estrogen that is going to surge during adolescence. Prior to that, boys and girls are a lot more androgynous, that is, they look a lot more alike. And plus, even as adults, these secondary sex characteristics are very variable for any given individual. But when we get to your primary reproductive system structures, the picture becomes much more distinct. So anatomically, as a system, you have these really distinct differences between the male and female, but also functionally as a whole, your reproductive system is different from something that we've talked about. Because up till now, it was about the survival of the individual organism. And so in that case, healthy working systems in every case are going to allow for a better life for the individual. If your muscles and your brain are at optimal function and doing their job, your chances of a good life are that much better. However, the reproductive system and your innate drive to employ it in its natural function is the cause of much of the turmoil in your life. As opposed to the survival of an individual, the function here is continuation of the species. And so to do that, males and females will both produce, transport, and nourish the sex cells, or gametes, in the reproductive organs, the gonads. The anatomy and location of these gonads is where the male and female anatomy really start to look and function differently. Female anatomy is also going to include the uterus, which is the site of development for the fertilized egg into a fetus. And then the male reproductive system has no such responsibility and is only geared toward delivering the sperm to the female egg. And additionally, there's going to be associated ducts, that is passageways, accessory glands, and most famously, the external reproductive structures. So being biologically male and female, then it has to do with these structures, and unlike the slope of a forehead, or the width of your hips, or your given muscle mass, females have organs that the males simply do not have, and vice versa. It's very simple, right? Maybe not. Variation, although much less common, can also occur. However, the early embryo is completely androgynous, meaning none of those distinct structures have formed, and this fetus's sex cannot be determined anatomically. So here I'm going to talk about development, although I'm not going to ask you about any of these embryonic structures, and I'm not going to ask you about genetics, but it is interesting. And in your healthcare profession, you're going to come across a wide variety of individuals, and understanding how these distinct male and female's organ develops are going to help you understand the variability that's going to occur in rare cases. So at around 7 weeks, a fetus that's carrying the Y chromosome begins this initial stage of sexual differentiation. The SRY gene initiates a program which will turn the gonadal ridge into the sperm and testosterone producing male gonads, the testes. Without that SRY gene, the gonadal ridge is going to develop into the female gonads, the ovaries, which produce the female eggs as well as estrogen. So the testes and ovaries develop from the same embryonic tissue, and they have the same common function of producing gametes as well as their respective sex hormones. So these two are referred to as homologous structures, although keep in mind not all structures derived from the same embryological tissue are going to serve similar functions like this. So these other two different embryological tissues are going to become distinct organs. And again, you don't have to know the names or what they become, but these Mullerian ducts, here in red here, are going to go on to form the right and left uterine tubes, or fallopian tubes, and that the right and left regions are going to fuse to form the uterus. That other embryonic tissue, called here the Wolffian duct in orange here, they're just going to die off because they do not form any structures in the female. But in the male, these Wolffian ducts, here in orange, go on to form the ductus deferens, commonly known as the vas deferens of the male reproductive tract. These tubes are going to transport sperm from the testes and eventually to the male urethra. And those Mullerian ducts in red are just going to die off because males do not have an equivalent structure homologous to the uterus. And this is why males cannot have a baby. So that's the development, or simple picture, of development of those internal reproductive structures, and consequently the testes and the ovaries are going to go on to produce the sex hormones that are going to influence other aspects of development. So that's generally how development proceeds with these cascading events. So these gonads, which started out very similar, are going to end up in very different places and have very distinct effects consequently. So that's your internal reproductive structures that are developing like that, and how the genetic program started by a gene on the Y chromosome is responsible for those initial events. The early fetus also has undifferentiated external genitalia. And around what is called the perineal region, there's an opening which over the next few weeks will close into two separate openings. Around that opening there are characteristic swellings that are going to turn into the external genitalia. So these swellings, which are present in both males and females, are going to go on to form the homologous structures of the external genitalia. And these are homologous in embryonic origin, but not necessarily homologous functionally. So that genital tubercle develops into the penis in the male and the clitoris in a female. The labioscrotal swelling becomes, guess what, the labia majora and the scrotum. And in males, the urethral folds become internalized within the penis to become the spongy urethra and will become the labia minora in the female. So we'll get to these near the end of the lecture, but these are the developmental origins and why they are considered homologous structure. And this also introduces us to that rather undignified pose to expose the perineum region of the pelvic floor. This region encompasses the pubic arch anteriorly down to just posterior of the anus and can be further divided into the urogenital and anal triangles. So these external structures in these regions are referred to as perineal structures. So here's the features we're going to cover for both male and female. Gonads here in blue, the tracts and ducts that the gametes will take, the complicated route in the male, and the more simple but tremendously more involved pathway of the female gamete. And along the way there's a few accessory glands and those perineal structures just mentioned. So I'm going to go back and forth between the male and female, stressing both the similarities and the differences of all these structures. So first we mentioned that the gonads, the testes of the male and ovaries of the female, began from a common embryological origin, but then ended up in a different position. Both male and female gonads are going to migrate down as the embryo grows, but we'll discuss the male here, which is a little more dramatic. This journey is referred to as the descent of the testes, whereas the testes are going to be drawn down by a kind of cord called the gubernaculum testes that's anchored to the base of the scrotum and pulls down the testes through the pelvic cavity and through the abdominal wall, along with all the associated blood vessels, nerves, and ducts. The passageway of the abdominal wall that it passes through is the inguinal canal, and as the testes passes through it, it brings along with it part of your internal oblique muscles, which are going to go on to form a muscle called the cremaster muscle, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that inguinal canal is an opening within the inguinal ligament where the spermatic cord, which is going to be your vas deferens and associated blood vessels and nerves passes through. Because these structures and the inguinal canal are continuous with the peritoneal cavity, it's possible for part of your intestines to be pushed through this hole, which is what a hernia is. Anyway, the testes, which have descended down through that inguinal canal to settle outside the body cavity in the sac-like pouch, the scrotum. So, evolution's rationale for this famously vulnerable position is that sperm production and development, which is the main function, occurs optimally at temperatures a little lower than your normal body temperature. The temperature of the testes can also be modified by the cremaster muscle, which will draw the testes up toward the warmer body cavity to retain heat, and they can be relaxed so that the testes are farther away from the body in warmer temperatures. So here's a cross-section of the testes within the scrotal cavity. You can see the pouch is just an extension of the skin with an epidermis and dermis, and the testes are sitting inside the scrotal cavity. So the female gonads descend, but they're going to remain in the well-protected pelvic cavity and settle down close to the uterus and uterine tubes. So the ovaries are closely positioned with the uterine tubes, but they are also distinct structures from them and are not directly connected. The ovaries are going to be held in place in the pelvic cavity and held closely to the uterine tube and uterus by several ligaments. This broad ligament, the cape-looking structure right here, is continuous with the parietal peritoneum and is going to provide a route for blood vessels and nerves to pass to the ovary and uterus, kind of like a mesentery. The ovaries are held in relative position to the body wall by the suspensory ligaments. And there's also the round ligament, which is going to secure the ovary around the pubic symphysis, and that structure does pass through the inguinal canal. And importantly, as we'll see, the ovaries are held close in position next to the fallopian tubes by the ovarian ligament. And that'll be important when we talk about ovulation. So that's it. That's the development in general of some of those reproductive structures, and then more specifically the location of the male and female gonads and how they got there. See you next time.